Hello, Willie. Thank you very much for joining us today. Would you be so kind as to introduce yourself to the viewers of this video?
Sure. My name formally is Iser de Leon. People call me Willie. I am an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Florida. I'm also a product of the University of Florida. I got my bachelor's degree here and my PhD here as well, with a short side trip to Western Michigan University for my master's degree with Wayne Fuqua.
Great. Well, great lineage, I hope, anyhow, Willie. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We're going to talk today about preference assessment protocols and methodology. And you've done a lot of work in that area. Would you be so kind as to tell us how you got involved, what got you interested in this particular topic?
I think my initial foray into it had to do with using existing procedures, things that we had read in the literature, things that we were doing in the lab by way of identifying reinforcers for some of our clinical work when I was a graduate student here, and then noticing deficiencies, if you will, things that if you thought about it a different way, you'd realize that the aspects of the published literature were faulty, that this wouldn't be the best method, that there was something to be improved upon. And so, in essence, we started doing studies to determine whether we were right about our ability to improve upon what was existing out there. And so we did one and another, and then beyond that got interested in not so much methods of identifying reinforcers, because we got that down pretty good after a while, but started moving into not what is preferred, but why is it preferred. So we started doing research on determinants of preferences and what makes kids, in essence, we work mostly with kids and sometimes adults with intellectual disabilities, but what makes them like the things they like. And so that sort of line of research evolved into 20 years of studying what kids like, in essence.
It sounds like a nice line of research, largely motivated by dissatisfactions with methodology and looking for ways to improve things. So, fantastic. In the behavior analysis literature and treatment area in particular, can you talk about why people are interested in doing a preference assessment? Where does it fit into the bigger picture of developing effective interventions, Willie?
Sure. Well, in educational and therapeutic programs for individuals with intellectual disabilities rely exquisitely, as we know, on the identification of effective reinforcers. So in things like discrete trial instruction, we get better progress when we identify stimuli that can actually increase appropriate kinds of behavior, and we use these sorts of methods to identify stimuli that we can plug into therapeutic programs. So both education and training, this is very important. And historically what has happened is the methods that are common, that are conventional now, aren't necessarily all that new or novel. People had been playing around with these things for a long time, but just in less formalized ways. But even before that, what was probably most common is people were doing things like reinforcer surveys, asking parents, sometimes asking children themselves if they had a relatively intact vocal repertoire, what they would like to work for, in essence. And what got discovered eventually was that parents and teachers and the children themselves aren't necessarily the best reporters of what will ultimately be an effective reinforcer in an instructional or a therapeutic program. And that being the case, people started figuring out, like, well, we need methods to figure out what would be the most effective. And that's sort of what gave rise to formalized versions of preference assessments and subsequently reinforcer assessments that have characterized this field.
You've already mentioned at least one of the types of approaches to assessment or preference assessment, self-report or interview process. Would you kind of walk us through some of the major methods for doing preference assessments and help practitioners understand the strengths and limitations of each so
Sure.
they can kind of match the preference assessments to their unique situations?
Sure. Well, the most common form out there in actual practice today, and this was documented in a recent survey by a colleague of mine, Rick Graff, is still a self-report or a parent report or a teacher report method. But as I just mentioned a little while ago, there was good reasons to get away from that. As it turns out, if you look at the literature on self-report or caregiver report, parents and teachers are pretty good at identifying that one stimulus that might be the most powerful tool in the toolkit as far as arranging effective consequences. But they're not very good at giving you a sensitive array. So yes, I might be able to tell you as a parent that this is what my kid likes best, but I might be less able to tell you whether this second item would be an effective reinforcer, or this third one, or give you that sort of hierarchy. And that was really the utility of these methods. And there's good reasons why you need to identify more than one thing. So parents, teachers can tell you the top stimulus. They're actually pretty good also at telling you what's on the bottom end. They're pretty good at telling you, no, that's not going to work with my kid. But it's that hierarchy that these formalized methods permit you to develop. Probably the first formalized method was what's now commonly called single stimulus preference assessment, developed by Pace and colleagues in '85. And it's just very, very simplistic format. In essence, you gather a collection of items that are candidates, in essence. Now, how do you gather those items? You go back to parent or caregiver report. That's where these things do have great utilities. Like, all right, parents can suggest to you these things might be the things you want to test. Now once you have a collection of those items, the simplest way to go about testing them is what Pace and colleagues did was simply measure approach or reach, if you will, for an item once it's in front of a child. So you might have a collection of 10 items or so, and you place one at a time. First, you give the child some exposure, and that's a common process in all these assessment procedures. You give the child some exposure to each item just to make sure that the child knows what to do, which is not also necessarily always the case. But then in the formal testing process, you simply place the item in front of the child and measure whether the child approaches or not. You put that item on the side. You bring in the next item, see if the child approaches or not. It's probably best not only to measure approach, which was kind of what happened in the initial study, but approach and what we now tend to call consume. Once the child approaches the item, if it's a toy, does the child actually play with the thing that's reached for? So you can see how simple that would be to arrange. If you have 10 items, you just place one at a time, and then you repeat this a series of times. So each item might be placed in front of the child 10 times. And in essence, what you're measuring is how many times the child approached, consumed that item, given the number of times it was available. So the output of such a process looks something like this. And this is simply a graph that shows 16 items. In the original study by Pace and colleagues, they used the same 16 items for all kids. But the percentage of time that each item was chosen out of 10 given it was available. And so those items ranked at the top. So in this case, there's a couple of items that were chosen 100% of the time. You make a prediction that those are the most effective reinforcers. And then you go about testing them. I'll get back to that in a minute. And so this works fine. It's very easy to do. It's very simple. It's not hard to score. It's not hard to administer. But what was subsequently determined was that it may not be very sensitive to relative preferences. What I mean by that is some kids or some individuals to whom are exposed to this sort of procedure may have the sort of history where they get very few things unless somebody gives it to them. And subsequently, they may take anything that is given to them, regardless of whether it's valuable or not. It's just the history. And so a few years later, researchers came along and tried and examined that sort of sensitivity, because the risk is that the individual being tested, will reach for anything. And just because the individual reaches for it doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be an effective stimulus when arranged in a reinforcement contingency. And that's what was subsequently found.
So if I understand the procedure, it sounds like the child has a choice of reaching for whatever the presented object is or doing nothing.
Or not, yes.
So in many cases, anything is better than nothing is part of what you're saying, it
Correct.
sounds like, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, if you worked some with children on the autism spectrum, sometimes they're notorious for having not attending well to things in the environment. Do you have to take any special steps to make sure they're attending to the object that's available in a single stimulus preference assessment?
Yeah, so part of the pre-exposure process is related to that. It's true. You want to make sure that there is focus on it, and eye contact with the stimulus might be an issue in some cases, and you will see children actually reach blindly for things. So sometimes what we'll do, and although this becomes an issue in all sorts of preference assessment formats, whether the child is actually making valid selections. Because sometimes what you'll see is in choice-based formats, for example, which I'll describe in a minute, what you'll see is flat distributions. Not, everything will be chosen about evenly, meaning or suggesting at least that the child is making random choices and not really attending to the stimuli as you suggest. And so there's things that people have done to sort of get around those issues by changing the format, the presentation format, for example. In choice-based procedures, for example, a common thing is to not put the items right in front of the child, but make it so that the child has to travel, has to exert some effort to one corner of the room or another, for example, to gain access to an item. And that little bit of additional effort actually promotes the expression of more valid choices in many cases. But like many things, it depends on the child. There's different strategies you might use depending on what the problem is.
So when you say approach in a single stimulus preference arrangement, it may actually be physically walking to the object, some little bit of response effort to get to it, essentially.
Right.
Okay.
So, and you can see how that works. If the problem with a single stimulus assessment is that I'll reach for anything that's in front of me, well, that might be true, but will you walk across the room for anything that's in the other side of the room? That may not be true.
I'm sure, good point. So. And the way you described at least the initial protocol, it sounds like it may take a while to run a whole series of trials. If I understood correctly, 16 different items, 10 trials each. That's 160 different approach trials.
Right.
So that could take quite a while if you had a lot of items in your array. Yeah.
Sure. And beyond that, the convention is to permit the child some access to the stimulus after it's chosen. So that varies from setting to setting or even from study to study. But if it's 20 seconds of access, that adds 20 seconds to each trial. And so now you're talking about a couple of hours in a preference assessment.
Yeah, that's a point I hadn't thought about. If you're using something like an iPad or a video or music, you can't just let them touch it and take it away. That's not the way those types of stimuli function. You have to have some engagement, don't you?
Yeah, and even that 20 to 30 seconds of access to the stimuli may be insufficient. In fact, we've done some research recently to look at that question. We've been chasing these questions about the value of continuity is what we've been calling it. But you think about what we commonly do in a preference assessment is exactly as you described. We permit a child to make a choice or to approach an item and give them 20 to 30 seconds access of it. And if it's a video on an iPad, well, who wants 30 seconds of video on an iPad? You want, if you're playing a game, you want to play it until your man dies, if you will. Or if you're watching a YouTube video, you want to get to the end of the video. And so that continuity sort of enhances the value as a function of being able to reach that end is what we're finding. In fact, I won't go into this research in great depth, but one of the things that we find is if you permit children to choose how they want to work for a reinforcer, either through a token system that will permit them to accumulate the entirety of a video, or through an immediate delivery system in which they complete one bit of work and get 30 seconds, one bit of work and get 30 seconds, overwhelmingly the children will prefer to accumulate and have it in its entirety, despite the delay to the actual reinforcer inherent in that accumulation procedure. So It is an issue, but
It is an issue, so that makes perfectly good sense from my perspective. You don't watch a television show or a movie in 30-second segments. It's not quite as enjoyable as watching the whole thing, essentially. So it makes good sense. You talked a little bit about the single stimulus preference assessment. Are there other alternatives that you'd like to describe to people that get around some of the limitations
Sure.
of the single stimulus preference assessment?
Sure. So there's probably three others that we might say are most common. And I talked about that lack of sensitivity of the single stimulus assessment. And so what came along next was what was originally called the forced choice procedure by Wayne Fisher and colleagues. Which people it was perhaps poorly named at the time, because forced choice, the term forced choice already is attached to a different procedure in behavior analysis, and that's not exactly what they were doing. So subsequently people started calling it a paired choice preference assessment, things like that, or paired stimulus preference assessment. Rather than just placing a single item in front of the individual, the paired stimulus preference assessment placed 2 items at a time. So you might have the same array of 10 items, but instead of presenting one at a time, you present choices. Choose this one on the left, choose this one on the right, and you ask the child to make the choice between the 2. And then what you do ultimately is present each possible pairwise permutation. So if you have 10 items, each one of them will be paired with each other one. That increases the number of trials of pairings. And in fact, if you're interested in such things, the formula for all possible pairwise permutations is the number of items times the number of items less 1 divided by 2. So if you have 10 items, it's 10 times 9 divided by 2, 45 trials it's going to take you to do all possible pairwise permutations. But doing so, what the researchers have found enhances the sensitivity of the hierarchy. So rather than a child just choosing anything that's in front of them, now they're forced to express a choice. I may reach for this if it was by itself, but if I have to choose one of these 2, I'd rather have this one. Now you're getting into some more sensitive preferences. And what Fisher and colleagues ultimately found, in fact, their study was a comparison between this paired stimulus assessment and the single stimulus assessment. And what they found ultimately was for those children that expressed invariant preferences, that is, they reached for everything in the single stimulus assessment, but in the paired stimulus assessment, you get a much nicer hierarchy. So the results of a paired stimulus assessment don't look all that different from the single stimulus assessment. In each case, you are looking at the number of times an item was chosen given the number of times an item was made available. But here you see the results for one child, and the gray bars in this graph are the results, the selection percentages of the single stimulus assessment. The black bars are the selection percentages for the forced choice assessment. And what you see for the forced choice assessment, or what I'm calling now the paired stimulus assessment, is a nice hierarchy. There are things that are rarely chosen, but there are things that cluster at the top that are chosen with great frequency. Whereas you see the gray bars for the single stimulus assessment, there's lots of things that cluster at the top, including some items that were not frequently chosen at all in the paired stimulus assessment. So the subsequent analysis conducted in that study was, well, when one predicts that this is a highly preferred item, but the other method predicts that this is not a highly preferred item, which one is more accurate? And over a series of individuals run doing that comparison, what we see is that the paired stimulus assessment is actually more sensitive to relative preferences than the single stimulus assessment. So in essence, what happened was that paired stimulus assessment, if you follow this literature, and even in clinical practice when there's time to do these things, has become the gold standard. That's when people come up with new permutations, new ways of doing preference assessment, it's common, it's conventional to compare it to this paired stimulus assessment, having shown that great sensitivity and other features that it has. Stability over time has been demonstrated on a limited basis, things like that. So.
Well, it sounds like a nice advance in reality, and it simply makes the point that everything is relative.
Sure.
So
Exactly.
Preferences are relative to what the alternatives are. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So other procedures that have been developed, Willie, what else has been developed and pros and cons of them?
The 2 other more common, one of the limitations of this, obviously, it has more, it has that greater sensitivity than its predecessor, but The number of trials is an issue. So now you're pairing everything, and sometimes you want to repeat this a few times. So you're talking often when Fisher and colleagues, for example, did the study, they used the same set of 16 stimuli. Now that's, a couple hundred trials takes you a couple hours to do. So the length of the assessment, if you're looking to repeat it with any regularity, is an issue. So it has that sensitivity. The trade-off is the effort involved. So the next set of developments really had to do with, can we shorten this? Can we produce similarly sensitive results in less time, in an abbreviated format? And the reason that you want an abbreviated format has to do with being able to do this with great regularity, because preferences aren't necessarily stable. Preferences are dynamic. Some days you like orange juice, some days you like apple juice, and as it turns out, changes in preferences are reflected by changes in reinforcer efficacy in many cases, under many circumstances. So if I stop liking this as much, it's not as effective a reinforcer. That literature gets muddy, but that's one of the conclusions that's been drawn. So the efforts to make the procedure briefer essentially led people to present things not in pairs, but the entire array at the same time. So now if I'm asking a child which of these 7 or 8 things you prefer, what later became known as the multiple stimulus assessment, and then subsequently the multiple stimulus without replacement assessment, arranged such that all the stimuli were laid out at the same time. The child was asked to choose one. In the later version, the multiple stimulus without replacement, the child chose one. As is convention, the child was given some time to engage the item, get access to the item, and at the end of that period, the item gets taken away. And then you test the remaining 6 items or the remaining 7 items, whatever is left. And so the child chooses the next one, has some time to access, and then that one goes off to the side, and now you test the remaining 5 items. And you keep going this way until the child either stops choosing or every item has been chosen at least once. Now you've got a test of multiple stimuli, 8 stimuli in just 8 trials. What you probably want to do, and what people have done at that point, the first evaluation of multiple stimulus without replacement repeated this process 5 times with 7 items. So you got 35 trials. It doesn't take you very long, but you got fairly sensitive information about those 7 items. And then subsequent studies came along and said, well, do we really have to repeat it that often? Or can we just do it 3 times and still get the same sort of accurate information? And it turns out, yes, you don't have to do it 3 times. Seems to be sufficient. And other folks have just done it once. I'm a little uneasy with that, but a 7 trial preference assessment, you don't get a lot of reliability of choices across time. But the point was to make a brief assessment, and the original set of studies suggested, yes, it produces a good hierarchy, a sensitive hierarchy, one very similar to the paired stimulus assessment, but it does so in far shorter time. And again, the point being, if you can do it, if you can get a good sensitive hierarchy in far shorter time, now you can do this every day, or you can do this before a daily intervention or daily or instructional sessions, because it's so short. You can feel better about having chosen the stimulus that's going to be effective right now at the moment.
Well, that makes perfectly good sense. And it sounds like if you repeat the sequence of options, you tend to get somewhat stable sequences of selection within at least a certain day, it sounds like.
Sure. Now, that changes across time. Again, we said preferences are dynamic, and people have done those studies. People have examined long-term stability of preferences, and of course, they change, like they change for everybody. But within a short period of time, yes, good stability. People have done those sorts of studies on both the multiple stimulus without replacement assessment, have done it on the paired stimulus assessment. And is it perfectly stable? No, you wouldn't expect it to be perfectly stable, but it's sufficiently stable that you feel relatively confident that what you've chosen, at least for now, is an effective stimulus. And then people do the validation studies to make sure that that's true, and sure enough, they turn out well. So
now, on the MSWO, the multiple stimulus without replacement. Are there any downsides to that one, Willie? Or any contraindications for using that particular model? It sounds like it's a great model.
Yeah, there are a couple. And one has to do with the child's ability. So what are the what are the circumstances under which you would not recommend this for a child? Scanning is one thing. If a child is unable to fully take in this array or has those problems attending to multiple stimuli at a time, then the child may make rather random choices. So that is one issue, and people have looked for ways to make sure that the child is able to attend to all stimuli simultaneously, often by pushing the number of items that you can include in an array. Nobody's got a definitive answer on this. The first studies used 7 or 8. They were just following other studies. But think about it. If you're presented, or if a child is presented with 15 items or 16 items, like children, like were being tested in the original single stimulus assessment studies or the paired stimulus assessment studies, that's a lot of things to be attending to at one time and making decisions about relative preferences. Do I really like this thing better than this thing over here? Loosely speaking, from the point of view of the child. So those sorts of difficulties. Another sort of odd problem that has been reported a couple times in the literature is this, and my sense is that this happens in children with more intact cognitive abilities, higher functioning individuals, if you will, is this sort of saving the best for last phenomenon. So you'll go through a multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment. And what you'll find is that the thing that is ranked first really is not an effective reinforcer when you actually test it. And then you can go back and talk to the child. It's like, well, tell me what drove your choices here. It's like, I was saving the best for last. I wanted to save that one until the end. And so you've got an outcome that's completely, opposite than what you're trying to produce with this procedure. But I think that's a relatively rare thing, but I think it is more common in children with more intact abilities, if you will. But
you talked about a couple of limitations and challenges. Would you like to say something to people about how you get around those limitations? In particular, how do you promote attending to and scanning all the different objects? And just out of curiosity, do you have to deal with positional biases and in terms of setting up your array and this as well as the paired stimulus arrangement?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times you'll see position biases such that the child will always select that thing that's on the right side. Often it has to do with the dominant hand, as you can imagine. But what does it suggest? It suggests that the child is not really attending, not really closely attending to the stimuli, such that whatever is chosen is that thing. Now, in order to detect that, you got to be also gauging, keeping track of position of items, which, it adds a layer of complexity to things like a paired stimulus preference assessment, because you want to make sure it's on this side one time, but then on that side the other time. And so it's not, in addition to making sure everything gets paired with every other thing once, you got to also keep track of the position of the things. But you can detect it, obviously, and it's probably not that hard to see very informally. This child is always going right. And so, some of the things that we have done to promote at least more valid choices, or what appear to be more valid choices, including, well, an easy one is separating the items. So we talked a little bit earlier about, put them in different sides of the room. That works for us sometimes. Separating the items sometimes works for us. Sometimes it's less of an attention problem than it is a motor problem, in which case what we've done is to center the choices in a paired stimulus assessment, for example, around that dominant hand. So one on one side of the dominant hand, one on the other side of the dominant hand, rather than one inside of or in front of each hand, right? So they're choosing with this hand no matter what, but both stimuli are equally centered away from that. Sometimes that works, but sometimes you gotta get creative. Sometimes we have to put them one in front of the other in a paired choice for the child to make sensitive choices, things like that. So.
Now, Willie, you're talking about positional issues with respect to paired choice. I assume that those also have implications for MSWO.
Sure,
too.
the same sort of
okay,
issues.
So same issues.
Now, the MSWO, the operation is a little bit differently in that you rotate the items after each trial. So a child selects one, and then you sort of shift the position of everything in between trials anyway. So everything that remains gets turned around. But if the child is making random choices, the child may still be picking whatever's on the left. So what do? You see a flat distribution when you look at those selection percentages, because I just chose over a series of trials, whatever was on the left, everything got chosen once because it was randomly positioned there at one time. And you don't get that sensitive hierarchy. So that's also a cue. Another problem that arises with both of those choice-based procedures, and a reason to sometimes adopt the one common procedure that I have not described, is the interaction of preference assessment and problem behavior. So, if you know the functional assessment literature, you know that in some proportion of children, problem behavior is maintained by the retrieval of preferred items, or, taking away preferred items, with the notion that the child has some sort of history of displaying problem behavior resulting in the return of items that got taken away, things like that. Well, if you think about what's going on in a preference assessment, you're giving a child a toy every 30 seconds or so, and then you're taking it away. And then you're giving them the toy, and then you're taking it away. So children who are sensitive to that sort of function of problem behavior, to the return of toys, if you will, don't necessarily do well in a choice-based procedure, or even an approach-based procedure, because of that constant return. So one alternative to that is what's been termed a free operant assessment, which is, in essence, here's the array of available stimuli. I'm going to permit you to enter this room with them. You might have some pre-exposure like you do with the other procedures, but I'm never going to take anything away. I'm simply going to measure how you allocate your time with each item. With the notion being that the greatest duration of time of engagement with a stimulus is indicative of the most effective reinforcer in that case. That works, and it has the added advantage of you can do it very briefly. In fact, it was developed initially as a brief preference assessment as an alternative to some of the other lengthier procedures, and you can get valid preferences that way without that constant removal of items that might be a problem for some kids. Now, the disadvantage of that procedure is that you might not get a good hierarchy, because you can imagine what will happen is some kids will go in and say, this item is so overwhelmingly better than everything else that you've offered me that I'm just going to play with this the entire time. No matter how many times you present this set of things, I'm just going to play with this. So you get information about only one item in some cases. You know that this is the top ranked item. You have no idea how the others compare. What is the relative value, if you will, of these other items? And as we mentioned earlier, sometimes when you're using things like reinforcer variation or presenting choices of reinforcers contingent upon appropriate behavior, it's good to have a selection of effective reinforcers. But that sort of procedure runs the risk of determining just one thing that you might be able to use.
So in that one, you look at, obviously, time allocation, how much time you spend with one versus the other. And I think you made reference to this, but it sounds like part of your pre-assessment routine is to require they be exposed to each of the items that are there. Kind of like, you go into a grocery store and they give you a free sample of food, under the notion that that may change your preferences to what you buy in the grocery store. That sort of model right there.
Yeah, and it's done as a control. I mean, you don't want to make assumptions about the utility, the value of an item if the child has never encountered that item. So it's sort of done, all right, we'll give them at least a little bit of exposure, let them gain access to it on a non-contingent basis, just so they know what the thing's about. But again, it's done largely as a control in these studies because, by and large, most of the things that get selected for inclusion in a preference assessment array in the first place are going to be things that the child's already familiar with. So we talked a little bit at the beginning about the utility or lack thereof of caregiver report. But one of the good uses of caregiver report is identifying the things that would go into a more formal preference assessment. So here's one good example. Probably the most common instrument for just the determination of those items that will subsequently go into preference assessment is this item called the RAISE, the Reinforcer Assessment for Individuals with Severe Disabilities, again developed by Fisher and colleagues, but it's a very simple tool. It just asks about a child's tendencies to value various stimuli categorized loosely into different sensory modalities. So you can see this question here asks, some children really enjoy certain foods or snacks, such as this, and this. What things do you think your child would like most to eat? And then you give the parent an opportunity to choose. And then it'll ask you questions about some children enjoy physical play or movement. Some children really enjoy tactile stimulations, touching things, different temperatures, that sort of thing. So it gives you it's a survey of, again, various sensory modalities. But really the point is to figure out, all right, what are we going to throw into this preference assessment? And then at the back end, it permits the caregiver simply to rank order those things. So you as the parent have nominated, if you will, 14 different stimuli. Now here are the 14 different stimuli. Which ones do you think would be best? And again, parents, as we mentioned at the beginning, parents are pretty good at saying which one is way at the top end, but the real utility of this is for determining what things are we actually going to test in the more formal procedure. So we start there, and as long as you do this process, most of the things that will get into your array are probably things that the child is already familiar with. So it's hard to say how much that pre-exposure is really an issue. But it's the sort of thing that we do for control anyway. But
it makes perfectly good sense to make sure there's some pre-exposure so the children will know from which they're selecting what the values are of that.
Sure.
Now, earlier we were talking about the free operant time allocation assessment process, and you're pointing out that sometimes one of the choices is so highly preferred you never get choices of the other options.
Sure.
Are there any strategies that get you around that and still give you the chance to do like a preference hierarchy?
There is. There's a reinforcer, what's been known as a sort of a restriction assessment, which is it's a bit of a hybrid between that free operant assessment and a multiple stimulus without replacement assessment. So in essence, the way that it works is that all the items are available at the same time, but for a limited period of time. And what you measure is as you do with the free operant assessment, how much time the child allocated or engaged each of the items. Now, you do that for, say, 5 minutes, and then you reset. And you do it a second time. Now, if the child allocated pretty much all their responding to the same item in the first trial, the first 5-minute trial, and did the same thing in the second 5-minute trial, you set some criteria, then you simply remove that item from the array and then you repeat it a third time. So people have, that will produce a more sensitive hierarchy. Again, it's been termed the response restriction assessment, but it solves that problem of the free operant assessment. The real problem with it is it's about the world's lengthiest preference assessment. If you got to do 5 minutes and 5 minutes and 5 minutes to produce a hierarchy, if it turns out perfectly, if the child's selections and engagement is perfectly stable, you need 5 minutes. Or rather 10 minutes, if that's your criteria, to place each item in the hierarchy, but rarely are those preferences so perfectly stable that you can do it in the minimum number of sessions. So the child might engage in item A for the majority of that 5-minute trial in the first trial, but maybe in the second trial, they choose something else. So none of those 2 items have met criteria. And so you got to keep repeating it until one of the items have met criteria, and then you got to keep doing it until all the items have met criteria in essence. So it could expand the time enormously.
Well, that inefficiency of that procedure would seem like it would contraindicate some clinical applications, especially if you needed to do frequent preference assessments. Some places do them just about daily or weekly, don't they?
Yeah. But you can see, the circumstances under which you are going to use these stimuli will dictate your needs. So that is a very lengthy assessment, but it has those advantages of overcoming the problem of frequent removal of stimuli, and it has those advantages of producing a more sensitive hierarchy than a free operant assessment, which is your other alternative if, frequent removal of stimuli. So depending on the child and the circumstances and how you're going to use it, how frequently you think you're going to use, how sensitive you want to be to shifting preferences across time, that's how you choose which method you use. So you take into consideration both the child and your practical needs for them.
Sounds good, Willie. Now, thus far you've talked about 4 different models: the single choice procedure, so to speak, the paired choice procedure, the multiple stimulus with and without replacement, and then the free operant assessment. Are there any other assessment processes or preference processes that we should know about for special applications, Willie?
Yeah, well, the other important thing to know about is what happens typically, at least in the literature, after a preference assessment, which is a reinforcer assessment. These are not necessarily the same sorts of things. A preference assessment is a prediction. It is based on a very simple response, reaching for an item. And what we've learned over time in doing a lot of work in this area is that predictions made on the basis of a very simple response, just like selecting or reaching something, may not necessarily map onto or be a perfect predictor of how well that stimulus will work as a reinforcer once you plug it into an actual a meaningful sort of contingency arrangement. So just because a child will reach for it does not necessarily mean a child will do a greater amount of work for it. So we've developed all kinds of procedures to, in essence, validate the results of those preference assessments. The preference assessments give you a hierarchy. It predicts that stimulus A would be a more effective reinforcer than B, which will be a more effective reinforcer than C, and so forth. Well, this is easily testable. You can plug it into simple contingencies to make sure that the predictions made by the preference assessment are in fact valid predictions. Stimulus A is in fact a more effective reinforcer than stimulus B. And so people have come up with a variety of procedures just to do that. They're also fairly simple. Probably the most straightforward thing is a simple reversal design where you're measuring levels of responding in a very conventional sense, usually frequency response rate, of some task, some task that the child can easily complete, usually a master task, if you will, in an instructional setting, and then just examine rates of that task in the presence and absence of that contingency. So here's one example of a simple reversal type of reinforcer assessment. And you can see what's going on here is levels of responses per minute are being gauged in the absence of any reinforcer. That's what the baseline is, and you can see that they're low. And now you drop in reinforcer A. So this is a reinforcement contingency, usually on a simple fixed ratio schedule, just for testing, and you can see the levels of behavior increase under this condition. Back to baseline, you can see that the levels of behavior return to the initial baseline level. So now you've got some idea. Yeah, this seems to be a stimulus that will in fact support response rates above what we might expect the child to display initially. Now we might want to test a different reinforcer, and that's what's going on here. So instead of going back to stimulus A, we've now inserted stimulus B and asked, is that also an effective reinforcer? And you can see that, yes, levels of responding return to something akin to what they were when stimulus A was the reinforcer. Back to baseline, they again that drop. And now we insert a third one, but what you see in the third one is response rates are not as high as you saw when reinforcer A and reinforcer B were the things that were being available contingent for engaging in the behavior. Now you've got some idea that well, the first two things are better reinforcers in this thing, and hopefully that's what your preference assessment predicted. So what you're looking for to see is whether this actually maps onto the hierarchy. So in a perfect world, A and B would have been ranked higher than C in this case, in the preference assessment, suggesting it was in fact a valid tool.
And does that indeed happen when you attempt to validate preference assessments by doing a reinforcer function assessment of this nature?
Yeah.
Or do you sometimes get discrepancies?
Oh, you get all kinds of discrepancies. Probably the most important one has to do with, begs the question of how sensitive do we have to be to relative value across these stimuli. So probably the most meaningful study along these lines was done by Roscoe and colleagues. And they did something very much like this. But instead of doing this straight up A, B, A, C, or A, B, A, C, A, D kind of single operant, this has conventionally become known as a single operant reinforcer assessment. They started with a different version, and what people have called a concurrent operant analysis, just to sort of offset it from this single operant analysis, but really all it is a concurrent schedule. So you might start with the same sort of baseline. Here's how it might look when graphed. Well, this one shows you an example, but you might start with the same sort of baseline, measure levels of behavior in the absence of any sort of reinforcement, but now you might arrange for two reinforcers to be concurrently available, each associated with a different response. So now the child can complete two versions of the same task. If they complete the blue version, they get stimulus A as a reinforcer. If they complete the red version, they get stimulus B as a reinforcer. And now you're asking about response allocation. Which one does the child choose more often? Which task, the red or the blue task, do they complete more often? Now you get a very sensitive test of relative reinforcer effects. If they consistently choose the red task, if you will, more often, you got a good idea that the stimulus associated with the red task is a better reinforcer than the stimulus associated with the blue task. Now, the Roscoe study started exactly that way and showed that stimuli predicted to be highly preferred via preference assessment do in fact draw more responding. More responding is allocated toward higher preference stimuli than to moderate preference stimuli. Several studies have done that and shown it in a concurrent schedule. There's the first to do so was probably a study by Kathleen Piazza in '96, just to show that high preference stimuli draw more response allocation than moderately preferred stimuli, which in turn draw more responding than low preference stimuli. That does in fact happen. The real interesting question that Roscoe and colleagues subsequently asked was, does it matter? Just because a stimulus is a better or a preferred reinforcer than another stimulus doesn't mean that there's necessarily a discrepancy in how effective each one of those stimuli will be when ultimately plugged into a single reinforcer arrangement. So what Roscoe and all did was show that, in fact, you can get preference under a concurrent arrangement, but when you take out that high preference stimulus and turn it into a single operant arrangement, the majority of kids will work just as fast, if you will, for that moderately preferred stimuli as they did for the high preference stimuli in the concurrent arrangement. Think about it this way. If you told me that I could do push-ups, and you'll give me $100 for each push-up that I do in this side of the room, or $10 for each push-up that I'll do in this side of the room, I'm going to stay on this side of the room. However, if the $10 side of the room were the only available option, I'm still going to do push-ups just as fast as I can, right? So under conventional arrangements, it could still be just as an effective reinforcer. So that concurrent arrangement is more sensitive to relative preferences, but we got to ask for actual instructional or therapeutic programs, does it really matter? Probably anything or most things that are at least mildly good may be good enough for reinforcement purposes.
And that's actually a great point, Willie, because kind of what you're saying to me is like there's this whole hierarchy of preferences. And the top 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 maybe, may function pretty well as reinforcers, though somewhere in here, maybe the ones way down the list don't function very well, but some of these may be essentially equivalent in terms of their reinforcing efficacy. And you can choose amongst any of those, it sounds like.
And it depends on your measure. And so, and that is, that's what that research shows. It's like, well, as long as something is at least moderately good, you can plug it in and find an effective stimulus for an instructional arrangement. The response rate isn't necessarily, for those exact reasons, isn't necessarily the most sensitive measure of relative reinforcer effectiveness. Again, as long as it's moderately good, then kids will work as fast as they can. So subsequently, people came along and started asking, well, that's just one measure. Do you get other, or do you get differences to other aspects of the behavior which might be important in practice? So for example, people started looking at high versus moderate versus low preference stimuli in a different kind of reinforcer assessment. So we talked about a single operand assessment, we talked about concurrent operand or just a concurrent schedule arrangement. Then people started asking questions about, well, will they support as much work? Not will the kid work as fast, but will the kid work as much? Will they complete as much work? And the way that's been tested frequently is through a progressive ratio schedule. So if the nature of a progressive ratio schedule is that the response requirements for producing the reinforcer increase progressively across subsequent trials. So the first time that a child has the opportunity to earn a reinforcer, they may only have to complete one task. But then the next time, in order to produce that reinforcer, the child has to complete 2 tasks and then 3 tasks. So that's a progressive ratio schedule with a step size of 1. It increases by 1 every time. And people, you can do this in various permutations. It doesn't have to be by 1. People will go, they'll do geometric progressions, things like this. But the point of the whole thing is to see where the child says, no, I don't want to do it anymore. That's too much work. So the PR schedule, kind of loosely speaking, gets at that question of how much work will the given stimulus support. And in some cases, folks have found differences between high, moderate, and low preference in the amount of work, the break points, if you will. That's what that point at which, that schedule value at which the child stops working is called the break point on a progressive ratio schedule. They have found differences in the break points between moderate, high, and low preference stimuli. So even though response rates may not show you great differences between different preference levels, if you will, there might be other measures on which you can get meaningful differences between these sorts of things.
So to go back to your push-up analogy, you might be perfectly happy to do 1 push-up for $10, but maybe not 20 push-ups for $10. But on the other side, you'd be happy to do 20 push-ups for $100, essentially.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
Okay. So that's an idea of how much work and where is the progressive ratio breaks and stuff like that.
If it's a little bit of work and all you're measuring is how fast I'll do it, I'll do it as fast as I can. But how much work may be a different issue altogether.
Okay, fantastic. Willie, you've done a great job describing all these different procedures, and so many of them are predicated on having an array of putative or tentative reinforcers. Do you have any advice for the practitioners about types of things that you would want to be cautious about building into your arrays of reinforcers?
A couple of things at least. One is, it's very common, and you see in the literature on these preference and reinforcer assessments, it's easy to use food as a reinforcer. Because food is easily distributed, it doesn't take a lot of time, and it is, in fact, a common sort of reinforcer in instructional context for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Food, of course, has its own set of problems related to dental care and health of various sorts. But in terms of concerns specifically for preference assessments, what the literature suggests is that if you have a mixed array of both food and non-edible items, activities, games, toys of that sort, and you're working with children with intellectual disabilities, the overwhelming evidence suggests that you'll get what has since been termed a displacement effect. That is, you can get high-ranking leisure items if you rank them, if you're examining them by themselves. The minute you throw them into an array with food, they get displaced. They get downwardly displaced. The food overwhelmingly becomes the top-ranked stimulus. So, and that's just the way it is. And people have considered various notions about why that might be, relating to the ease of extracting reinforcement, if you will, from one class of stimulus versus another, things like that. But for practical purposes, the point is, if you're interested specifically in identifying leisure items, toys, games, books, things like that as reinforcers, you got to identify them in a separate array, not in a mixed array with food. And as I started to say, food sort of presents its own set of issues. I'm not. I think I personally, and people may disagree with me, but I personally think of food as sort of a last resort in the world of reinforcers. In fact, we've cooked up this model that's sort of a reinforcer selection flowchart. And the things that we took into consideration when we were cooking up this model has to do with ecological fit. Not only are you looking to identify stimuli that are effective when you plug them into your instructional or your therapeutic programs, but you want to make sure that they actually are a good idea, a good fit for the context, the environment in which you're going to use those reinforcers. So you ended up thinking about things like, or considering questions about the classes of stimuli related to, is it easily replenished? Does it cost too much? Does it fit naturally in that environment? Can its use cause other sorts of detrimental effects? Can its use disrupt other activities going on, so for example, with other children in that environment? Does its effectiveness wane easily, diminish easily? Do you get quick satiation effects across time? Does its delivery disrupt ongoing behavior? And that's the sort of questions that I mean. So in my head, you have to balance effectiveness, and that's why we did all these preference assessments and these reinforcer assessments, but with how good of an idea is it to plug in this reinforcer in its environment. And that's sort of the thinking that led us into this reinforcer selection flowchart, where we thought it'd be best if you start out with, say, for example, in a classroom, those things that fit in most easily, most naturally. What fits in most easily and most naturally into classroom? Praise does. Social reinforcement does. However, not everybody is sensitive to social reinforcers. And you know, and people have suspicions. These are poorly tested notions, but suspicions, particularly if you're working with children on the autism spectrum, that they might be less sensitive to social reinforcers. That's actually is very debatable. Because we've all known children on the autism spectrum that are exquisitely sensitive to social reinforcers. So it can't be a pat assumption. But to the extent that social reinforcers fit best, you might as well try them first. And maybe you've determined, say, through something like a reinforcer assessment that they are not effective, that they don't sustain behavior to the extent that you want. You might even try, but if they do, then it makes most sense to go with that until they stop working. Even if they don't work initially, you might even consider attempts at establishing them. And people have done this sort of study time and time again. But if praise, teacher attention, things like this aren't initially reinforcers, can you actually establish them? Can you turn them into reinforcers through the sort of pairing procedures and similar operations that we know that people have established or used to establish conditioned reinforcers? There's no easy answer to that. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But the vast majority of the research suggests that it's a very difficult thing to do. It turns out to be best, or the most success people have had, has been through an arrangement in which a different reinforcer is delivered contingent on a reward, rather than just a stimulus-stimulus pairing, but a known reinforcer is already delivered contingent on a reward, and then that social reinforcer is paired at the back end, not before. And people have had some success with that in establishing praise as a social reinforcer, but unfortunately it tends to be a temporary effect, not a short-lived one. But it's worth a try because that, to us is the most ecological thing. If you don't find that sort of very natural stimulus effective, then you start moving to what we might call more contrived reinforcers. In my way of thinking, leisure activities make more sense than turning to food at that point if they're effective. Again, you try them. And the way that we have found, as I mentioned earlier, to make them most effective has to do with that notion of continuity. Let the kids accumulate, which usually means that you're using a token system. But it's important to try it. Make sure that, in fact, it does work. And it may not work because of the inherent delay involved in something like a token system, in which case you might resort, according to this model, you might resort to say, all right, we have to deliver little bits of reinforcer immediately after the response to get this kid to move in the right way. And so having exhausted all those possibilities and found no effective reinforcer, that's when I think you should introduce food into a classroom. But again, other people might differ Their opinions might differ, but that's the way I like to think about it, but that ecological fit notion. But.
Well, it does sound like there's not only a variety of procedures to identify preferences and putative reinforcers, but a lot of considerations that go into deciding which of those potential reinforcers might be programmed into a particular setting. And I really like also the notion of trying to establish other more ecologically valid stimuli as reinforcers, such as teacher praise, through some sort of a procedure. Now, all of this is focused really on identifying reinforcers, and for the most part, these are extrinsic, programmable reinforcers that are sometimes of a contrived nature. Mm-hmm. Some people raise objections to that, typically not behavior analysts, but some people raise objections saying that using an extrinsic reinforcer somehow or another undermines intrinsic motivation to engage in the behavior. Would you care to comment on that line of objections to the use of extrinsic reinforcers?
Yeah, I will a little bit. It's certainly an important question, and a question that's been asked for a long time, since the 60s, early 70s, with the work of Deci and Lepper and folks like that. And it has very serious implications if you think about it. If in fact these extrinsic reward arrangements undermine intrinsic motivation to engage in an activity, well, then you're faced with the position of, hey, I can arrange these reinforcement systems, but what I'm really doing in the long run is shooting this educational endeavor in the foot, if you will, because the child will lose their intrinsic interest, if you will, in this activity. So if I deliver reinforcers for reading, for example, the child, according to what is alternatively known as the overjustification hypothesis, will attribute their behavior to the reinforcer rather than to any internal interest, if you will, to the extent that we can work with that sort of construct. Now, I work, and you could see if that were a true thing, well, that would not be a good thing. And this debate has been going on for years. It flares up from time to time and very potently, very powerfully in educational circles, and particularly with arranging these reinforcement contingencies for children in educational settings. To the extent where folks trained in departments of education are often taught to avoid arranging these sort of artificial contrived contingencies, as they might be called. Again, that debate has raged for a long time with findings on this side, findings on that side, and a strong search for the circumstances under which it may or may not happen. So if you look, for example, at folks with a more behavior analytic bent that have examined this question, particularly through the methods of meta-analysis, where you gather lots of studies, and hundreds of studies are available on this topic. Well, you gather hundreds of studies and determine and examine through the methods of meta-analysis the circumstances under which an effect like this may or may not happen. Does it happen in this study? Does it happen in this study? Yes, no. Well, what are the differences between these two studies in which it does happen here but doesn't happen over here? You find outcomes consistent with the notion that, yes, there are circumstances under which it does happen, but they tend to be when the reinforcers are delivered either response independent on a non-contingent basis, and when they tend to be expected tangible rewards. When you move into the delivery of social attention, things like that, praise as a reward, it doesn't happen. It turns to be less of an effect. When you subsequently examine either kind of reward and examine what happens when those reinforcers are delivered in a response contingent fashion dependent on performance and or quality, you do not find this sort of effect. Well, the reason that's important is because that's the way that we generally arrange these reinforcement contingencies. We arrange it specifically based on criteria for reinforcement, so therefore less like the sort of circumstances under which you tend to find effects consistent with this overjustification hypothesis. Now, That's true of the literature in general. And other folks certainly argue with the methods of these meta-analyses, so that debate rages on. I personally work with children with intellectual disabilities, so I've gotten interested lately in what happens with that particular population, and so that I can then tell my students or other folks that arrange these contingencies in educational settings for children with intellectual disabilities, is this something that you have to worry about? So we started doing our own large-scale analyses. And what's an easy way to do that? Well, I told you about ABA reinforcer assessments, right? In which you have no reinforcement and then a reinforcement period and then go back to a no reinforcement to gauge the effectiveness of the stimuli. Well, those arrangements set up a perfect evaluation of this, excuse me, this overjustification hypothesis, right? All you have to do is examine levels of behavior after reinforcement relative to levels of behavior prior to reinforcement. So if what you observe is lower levels of responding after the reinforcer has been discontinued in that ABA reinforcer assessment design, then you got something that looks consistent with the outcomes or the predictions of overjustification hypothesis. On the other hand, if you find higher levels of responding after, in the second baseline phase, after the reinforcer has been discontinued, you find it's an outcome inconsistent with overjustification hypothesis, suggesting there is no detrimental effect of extrinsic reinforcement. And in our case, it is reinforcement rather than reward, because we've only examined cases in which the reinforcer contingency actually did meaningfully increase levels of responding, like we like to see in applied settings. So we've amassed something like 69 cases of reinforcer assessments to examine that question. And what we find, so we convert these into effect sizes. I won't get into the specifics of effect sizes, but in essence, what you find is the way to interpret them is a positive score in our case was indicative of an outcome consistent with overjustification hypothesis. A negative score is an outcome not consistent with it. And what you find is a distribution that does not differ from zero. In essence, it's random. Whether you're likely to find this outcome or not, you're just as likely to find it as you are not. The mean effect size does not differ from zero. So suggesting this is not a consistent happening. Now, if you examine only the first session after reinforcement is discontinued and the last session before reinforcer is introduced, you find something very different. Now, why is it important to examine it that way? Because most studies on the detrimental effects of extrinsic reward on intrinsic motivation have done exactly that. They had one data point. They usually do it as a group design, but they have one data point before the reward period, then the reward period, and then one data point after, just like in the original DESI study. If you examine the data from kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities that way, you find that response rates in that first session, immediately after discontinuation of the reinforcement period, is overwhelmingly higher than the last data point of the first baseline, suggesting overwhelmingly something not consistent with these detrimental effects, and more consistent with a very simple behavioral account of the gradual effects of extinction, right? We often see that extinction takes some time to set in. And so that's very clear and as I said, overwhelmingly inconsistent with these detrimental effects. We also took a search for what might be determinants. Again, I'm not saying that this doesn't happen. There might be circumstances under which an effect like this is reliably produced. And we kind of took a bit of a search for that. We looked at, well, does the schedule matter? Does the type of task matter? Does the different characteristics of the child matter? And we didn't find anything conclusive about that, except for one thing. The one thing that did stand out to us was a positive relation between the likelihood of finding an effect consistent with the overjustification hypothesis and how much responding the kid was doing in the first baseline before reinforcement was introduced. So what I'm saying is, the more the child was willing to engage in this activity before any reinforcement contingency was arranged, the more likely we were to find an effect consistent with this notion of detrimental effects. We did find that relation. Now, why is that important? Because behavior analysts aren't generally in the business of arranging contrived reinforcement contingencies for behavior that is already occurring at high rates. That's not why we set up these educational programs. So we thought that was a very interesting point about the circumstances under which we should and should not be caring about this in kids with intellectual disabilities. We don't see it with any great consistency. It's just as likely to happen and is not, suggesting no formal systematic effects. But where you do find a systematic effect seems to be when you're arranging a contrived contingency for things that are, or for behavior that's already occurring at a high level, which is, at least in my way of thinking, inconsistent with what generally goes on in practice in these reinforcement arrangements.
Well, that's a great perspective, Willie. And one of the reasons why this is an important issue is because some of the implications can be a little bit troubling. And, the suggestion might be that don't use extrinsic rewards to train behavior. Yet, so many situations we run into to train a person to read, for example. If you say, let's don't use extrinsic rewards, then you never acquire the skills necessary to contact the intrinsic benefits. You read something that's funny or enjoyable, or you read directions or something of that nature. So that would be a really troubling implication of it. And the other, I think, that you just mentioned at the end that just really makes a lot of sense to me is if you take a behavior that may have its own, so to speak, intrinsic reinforcing capabilities, reading being a good example, and you elevate it so high using a superimposed extrinsic contingency, then maybe it's not surprising that it goes back down after that extrinsic contingency.
Particularly if it was happening at a great clip before, because we know that
satiation happens, right? I get tired of reading. I get tired of listening to music if you're making me
wait. And if you look at those original DESI studies, something very much like that may have happened.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, this is a fascinating topic, absolutely. And it all ties in, of course, with reinforcer and preference assessment, how you program it in a way to build adaptive behaviors for children on the autism spectrum and those with developmental disabilities. So, Willie, is there anything else you'd like to offer in terms of bits of advice for practitioners interested in this particular topic?
No, I think I've said plenty about it. I guess I would like to leave folks with the thought that it shouldn't be ignored. Surveys of people that are out there actually in the field that try to gauge the extent to which these different formats are used and which ones are more likely to be used and whether they're used at all, to me are a bit discouraging. Again, this comes a little bit from the research that my colleague Rick Graff has done. Suggesting their use is not all that common, or not as common as we would like. So there's a tendency, for example, to incorporate it in part of a plan of care for a child, an IEP or something like that, and do it once and assume that now that we've done it, all right, that bit is out of the way, we know what this child's reinforcers are. It's like, but it doesn't work like that. As we mentioned earlier, reinforcers are not static. They are, in fact, dynamic. So it should be something that is routinely incorporated into what should be continuing assessment, not only of reinforcers, but of all sorts for individuals with special needs.
Well, fantastic, Willie. Thank you very much. It's an absolutely foundational concept for building an effective technology to improve the life and quality of life for children.
Oh,
thank you so very much, Willie.
That's been great. Thanks. This demonstrates the single item presentation method. So this will have happened after the child has had access to all the stimuli. And essentially what happens is the stimuli are presented to the individual one at a time. And the simple measure is reach, response, approach. And if it is approached, sometimes you also measure whether it gets consumed or not. Usually it's left in front of the individual for 5 seconds, and if no response occurs within 5 seconds, then it's taken away and the next item is presented. So that's what's happened in the first trial. In the second trial, the child has approached the item and is now engaging with it, and usually you give the individual about 20 seconds or so to engage with the item before finishing that trial, and then you start the next trial. And this just goes on until each item is presented, and the therapist, the teacher, the instructor simply measures whether a given item was approached or not. So it would be a positive score for the iPad, but a negative score for the other two things delivered so far, and then a positive score for this one. You exhaust all items, and then you just repeat for a set number of trials. The convention is something like 10 trials per item. At the end, you just produce a hierarchy based on the number of times each item was selected, given the number of times each item was presented. On occasion, in this procedure, as with most other procedures, the child won't actually want to relinquish the toy once the access period is up. So probably the most conventional thing to do at that point is to use a 3-step guidance procedure to take it, retrieve it from the child. So here's a reluctant child. So this demonstrates the paired stimulus procedure. Again, the notion here is that rather than presenting items singly, items are presented in pairs. This is a method that gives you greater sensitivity in the hierarchy. The child chooses one, same sort of arrangement, gets access for 20 seconds at a time. At the end of that 20 seconds, the item is once again removed, and then a different pair of items is presented. This continues until each item has been presented with each other item. That is, all possible pairwise permutations have been exhausted, and the scoring method is the same. You simply calculate the number of times each item was selected relative to the number of times each item was available. The other thing to note in this procedure is that the side in which the items are presented often has to be taken into account because, as we mentioned, some children do tend to show a position bias. So you want to be careful not to note if the child is actually just selecting whatever item is on the right side on each trial.
All right, my turn. Thanks.
On occasion, you'll find a child will try to grab both items at the same time. The convention under those circumstances is to block the child from grabbing any of the items, waiting 5 seconds, then representing and see if the child does in fact pick a single item. A similar procedure is used on occasions in which the child does not choose either of the items. That is, you retract the items after 5 seconds, and then in that case you represent the same pairs and see if on a second attempt at both items the child chooses. If the child does not choose either one on the second attempt, then those items, both items are removed and the next set of items are presented. So this demonstrates the multiple stimulus without replacement procedure. In essence, what happens here is that all the available stimuli in the array are put on the table. At the same time, the child is prompted to choose one. The child is given access. At the end of the access period, when the item is retrieved from the child, that one just goes away. The rest of the items get represented. You take the one from the right side and shift it all the way to the left side before the next representation, and then attempt to make the items equidistant again in front of the child.
All right.
This procedure continues until the child does not make any selections. The convention here is to give the child, as originally constructed, you gave the child 20 seconds to choose amongst the available items, and the session, if you will, continues until everything has been chosen at least once or the child has not made any choice for 20 seconds, regardless of how many items remain. Now that'll take you through one round of choices. In the original version of this procedure, 5 rounds were included, but subsequently other individuals showed that all 5 rounds weren't necessary. You can get information that was just as good and as sensitive by just doing 3 rounds. So with these 5 items, that'll be a total of 15 trials.
All right. Pick one. All right. Thanks. All right. All right, come on.
The last of these common methods is conventionally known as the free operant preference assessment. The items are laid out in the environment. The therapist escorts the individual into the environment and then simply lets them engage, interact with any one of the items that are in the environment that time. Unlike the other selection-based preference assessments, this one relies on duration measures. That is, simply what you're measuring is the amount of time that per time-limited session that the individual spends engaging each item. It'll be converted into a percentage at the end of the trial. The trials usually last something like 5 to 10 minutes, but again, the notion is that those items that result in the largest percentage of session time with interaction are the ones predicted to be the most highly preferred. Again, the hazard of this system is that an individual might engage a single item throughout the entire assessment. That is, not choose anything other than the most preferred. So you don't get much sensitivity in many cases with regard to the second, third most preferred items. The individual puts an item down and in fact goes back to a first item, you simply start tacking on more time to the duration engagement for that first item.